Hi there, my name is Anne Kaplan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Cultural, Gender, and Global Studies at Appalachian State University, which is part of the University of North Carolina System of Education. This is Framing Ourselves, Selfie, Portraiture, and Big Data. In this short presentation, I consider why we should study selfies as a form of image making and specifically as a form of contemporary portraiture / self-portraiture. Clearly, selfies are ubiquitous within a really common mode of communication globally, that of various social media outlets. They are popular forms of communication, visual communication, and visual rhetoric, not only in terms of sheer numbers, but also in terms of being part of popular culture and popular media. And strikingly, selfies have been somewhat neglected or abandoned as a subject of critical inquiry. And by critical inquiry, I mean not only analysis, but the application and consideration of critical theory as may be applied to selfie portraiture. Why then big data? Big data allows us to embed selfie portraiture within wider social trends from the local to the global, and allow us to look both within the selfie as a material object in terms of creator information, as well as look outside in terms of who and what entities may be gathering data concerning overall selfie use and trends, as well as the use of selfie statistics and big data from the mode of surveillance, whether that be government surveillance, military surveillance, or corporate surveillance. Key to this inquiry is the importance of framing selfies in context. Selfies are, though digital, a material form, a sensory and formal, as art historians and visual culture experts would say, a formal material where the history of portraiture and self-portraiture meets contemporary digital practice and social media exchange. Selfies thus, as in all material forms, maintain and explore and change a set of social affordances. Affordances being those realities that any form make possible and impossible in the world. So as such, selfies are linked strongly to a means to communicate through a popularized art form. So they're material and formal in their base. They act as a form of cultural capital, as has often been written about in the beginning of selfie analysis. We haven't gone much past this in contemporary selfie analysis, but certainly a means of performance and alignment of identity, especially within consumer capitalism. Selfies' social affordances also include engagement of a spectacle society that in a world in which image making and image broadcasting, image sampling is a main means of communication online, engagement within this via selfies create a place, a foothold, a location for communication of ideas, which brings us to the last one of symbolic communication in terms of the aesthetics and formal qualities of selfies and what they broadcast to viewers and participants. So it's couching selfies as a material form with social affordances within visual culture, within cultural studies, and within critical theory studies enables us to trace, connect, analyze, and apply the aesthetic and social use values of the selfie cross-referenced with what quantitative information, which of course can be interpreted as qualitative, with big data. So what does it mean then to frame the selfie in terms of formal and conceptual analysis? What does it mean to look at a selfie in context? So these ideas range from the formal visual, aesthetic, and sensory. So those physical qualities, even in a digital object, that the viewer, the experiencer, is intersecting with, right? Those qualities of content, framing, subject matter, focus, color or black and white, expression, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those formal, visual, aesthetic, sensory qualities to conceptual theoretical analysis. So though many social media analysts tend to look specifically at text and social relations, and those are very important not to be ignored, it's really key that we look at that visual and aesthetic set of criteria to then make conceptual and theoretical analysis from there, that it's in those sensory details that meaning arises. Included are, of course, that this can be a form of personal narrative, right? So these can be used as a means to record one's own information for personal purposes without any intent to publish further, or as a publicly available, quote unquote, publication that is posted on social media or published in other form, as well as what does it mean in terms of the digital circulation of these. So when a selfie is sent potentially around the world, reused, resampled, reformed, that is also a point of analysis. In terms of the selfie as a primary source, this is something that is beginning to be looked at, but really has been neglected for the last several years, that the selfie offers a primary source in the same way that others do. So we can have a debate about whether these are sources where absolutely everything about them tells the quote truth, but nonetheless they're incredibly valuable from the perspective of interpretation, especially from an individual narrator. And lastly, that it's important that we consider how social media, though we experience it in many ways in terms of text and image, is a computational form. It is basically number oriented, and in its back form, right, in terms of code. So big data is very, very applicable in terms of this mode of analysis, in that we can constantly look at numerical and geospatial information that's attached in all cases to social media and thus selfie exchange. Lastly, I want to make some connections, especially to major thinkers within critical theory, in terms of some of the ways we might consider selfie in terms of technology development, what that means and says about communication within the world, aesthetic forms, and cultural production. So here are just three main thinkers, historic and contemporary thinkers within critical theory, and I'll just kind of dipping our toe in the pool of how we might consider how framing selfies in terms of selfie, portraiture, and big data relates to these. So Walter Benjamin, the early 20th century theorist, and his work on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, of course, is a classic, but one in which we may consider how does the selfie operate in terms of Benjamin's considerations of the photo and film in terms of a digital form, and a digital form that self-represents. Clearly, the new-ish epoch of digital reproduction can be built upon Benjamin's mechanical reproduction. A second consideration would be the works of John Berger, who, of course, builds upon Benjamin's work in terms of aesthetics themselves and the sociocultural and political affordances of aesthetics in some of Berger's classic work for BBC and publications arising from those. A third example would be folks who are in fields such as gender studies, Africana studies, critical race studies, issues of creation and performance of identity. So Judith Butler being, of course, a main example whose classic texts consider how gender and identity are, in fact, a fluid, created set of forms that are really enacted and come from a set of social and cultural performances to self and performances to other. So these are just three of a sample of critical theorists whose work could easily be applied, and in my work is beginning to be, in terms of the selfie. To leave you with a few questions, we might consider where we might go from this conversation. So what can be gleaned from socioculture, economic, and geospatial data regarding selfies? What use patterns and implications of digital production, sampling, and remaking of the selfie imply? What do they imply overall socially? What does it mean to self-image and self-define through selfies in order to construct meaning in the material and location of a virtual digital setting? Here are a set of historic and contemporary works whose ideas I engage within this short presentation. I hope these will be helpful to you. And thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and please feel free to get in touch.